One of the questions or issues that we're facing is the degradation of our communities, really through a lack of understanding that the role that aesthetics play in creating places that are both economically viable and enhance our quality of life. And I wanted to really set the stage. Now let's see, Max, if I can do this. Okay. I wanted to remind you that in the 1950s, what we were seeing across the country was federal highway funds that were being used to slash through cities, destroy neighborhoods. This is Scully Square in Boston. Depress central business districts, and cut communities off from historic patterns and natural resources. Here's another slide of Scully Square. This is a great photo, is it not? And then I wanted to just briefly, here's Portland, Maine, and here what happened is that new roadways were brought into the city and allowed to slash right through the center of neighborhoods. I think back to Boston and how the highway came in and slashed through and cut Chinatown in half. And this was happening all over the country. There was really no consideration for what it meant to be a community. And it had enormous ramifications going forward in terms of creating urban blight, and economic distress for those communities. So here also, this is a slide of Strawberry Bank, which is now an outdoor history museum in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where I live. And one of the things I wanted to stress is that this area is only a small segment of more than 500 buildings that were proposed by urban renewal to be torn down in the residential neighborhoods of Portsmouth, that many of them dated to the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. And these were still somewhat economically depressed areas in the 50s. Many of the homes, right here where you see this is called Puddle Dock, had no plumbing, and there were several families that were living in houses. But what happened here was when the citizens heard about this proposal, they rose up and they said no, right? This was in 1954, and it was one of the very first times that urban renewal dollars were used to save a neighborhood rather than destroy it. And this is a slide of Strawberry Bank today. And it has become one of the key economic catalysts for our community, and preserving over 38 buildings that date from anywhere from 1690 through the 18th century. And these buildings are on their original site, as opposed to some other living outdoor history museums, and they are the original buildings. And so they contain within them the history of more than 300 years or generations of families that lived in these buildings. So some of these buildings have exhibits that actually are based on World War II, a grocery store, a 1950s apartment, because these are how these buildings were actually used right up to the time that they were threatened by destruction. And this is a huge economic generator for the city. And now what we have done is we've also are in the process of bringing online close to 20 properties that are being rented out for offices and for apartments and studios within these buildings. So we're making them opportunity not just for an educational museum, but livable, affordable units in our downtown, which is undergoing huge success today, really as a result of historic preservation. So one of the things that I wanted to stress was that this is a partnership that starts at the local level, engages the state level, and the federal level. And there were tools that were put in place after the conference on scenic beauty. And one of the most important tools was the National Historic Preservation Act of 1968. And that was followed by another tool in 1976, which was known as the Federal Investment Tax Credits for Rehabilitation. And since that time, more than $75 billion of private investment have been put into historic buildings around the country for commercial purposes. But unfortunately, we haven't seen the same commitment at the federal level. So among our solutions is really first and foremost to insist, and you may know that it's in jeopardy right now, is that the monies for the Land and Conservation Fund and for the Historic Preservation Fund be restored and be expanded. And these monies come from offshore dwelling rights. They have nothing to do with the operating fund of the federal government, except that sometimes those monies are snagged to support the operating dollars in Washington. But there's a huge residue of dollars that is sitting there that could literally transform this country. And we need to stand up and demand, first of all, that right now that fund has been defunded as of September 30th. Demand that it be put back in place. And then we need to fight any way that we can to expand those dollars if we're going to promote community character and achieve a more beautiful America. So one of the most positive changes was we talked about these tools that came after this conference. And here you can see as a result of that, I've just got a couple of slides. These are really basically workforce housing from the 19th century, vernacular architecture, not grand architecture, that 50 years ago was not valued, was not cared about, in many instances was demolished. But here you have New Bedford today that has made a commitment to recognize the historic core of its community and has provided, authentic restoration of these buildings, added cobblestone streets. Maybe it's a little cute with gas lanterns, but you know what? People love it. They absolutely love it. And you can think about cities all across America and towns that have invested in this kind of protection and improvement, and they are the communities that are economically thriving today. So here also is Pike's Place in Seattle, Washington. So not only do we have sort of those residential or vernacular buildings, but we have whole downtowns that have revitalized themselves. We give a lot of credit to the National Trust for their Main Street program and committed places where people want to gather because they are vibrant and they are attractive. And one of the things we should focus on going forward is, we have a new generation coming forward, the millenniums. And what do the millenniums want? The millenniums want attractive places to live. They want places where they can walk, where they can recreate. They want hike and trail bikes. They want artisanal food and farmers markets. And this is a very important trend. And if we as a nation and we as at the state level and local level fail to recognize that, those communities that don't buy in to the changing demands of the millennium generation are going to be left behind. One of the problems we're still seeing, in spite of the progress that's been made, is in many instances we're still fighting with unplanned urban and suburban growth, which has continued to be allowed to undermine the distinctive character and individual sense of communities, resulting in the phenomenon known as What's Anywhere USA. So what we need to do in order to, and here's some other slides, again, this is pretty appalling, right? And this is Anywhere USA. We see this wherever we go. We don't have to put up with this. And as you've heard, we can make those changes without relying on the federal government in many instances. Here, sprawl as opposed to smart growth. And so what we really need, we talked about a national program to create gateways into communities. Here's what you've seen, some slides that are taking place. This is Pennsylvania, where they are decorating their highways and the entrances into their communities. This is Rhode Island. You've already seen one of these views here. This is a very exciting program that Margaret referenced. And here also, there's the challenge between regulation and incentives. And for instance, in Texas, they have this Scenic Cities program that could be adopted nationwide, which recognizes and celebrates those cities in Texas that have adopted ordinances that will ultimately result in more beautiful cities. And there's a whole talk about having a toolbox. There are all kinds of ordinances that communities can look at, from banning digital billboards to insisting that there be beautification in their parking areas. We don't have a slide here, but you may be aware that in Chicago, all of the parking lots have to be surrounded by attractive greenery. No. So that's really an important tool. But one of the other problems that we have is, in many instances, local communities simply do not have the resources, even though historic district commissions were created. And so now what we need to do is we need to give those tools to those citizens and those local communities who want to make a difference but don't have the resources. We should require people sitting in all of our land use boards to have training, because the decisions that they make impact on all of us. And finally, we want to talk about a little bit here. This has to do with the question of franchise design and changing the standards so that they are more visually attractive, more aesthetically compelling, and it can be done. What you're looking at here are two different Shell stations, for instance, where in one place they were willing to respect the character of the community. Another example, this is McDonald's. On the left is a traditional McDonald's. On the right is McDonald's that has been housed in a historic building in South Freeport, Maine. And because the community stood up and said, we don't want the traditional McDonald's in our town, this is what they got, because McDonald's desperately wanted to be in that community. Here's another. This has to do with these are the issue of on your roadways, and we're talking about if we're going to allow and lease out franchises along our rest stops on our highways, we should demand that these are aesthetically appealing, attractive, and invite people to come in and do away with that Anywhere USA. Another here is Starbucks. One traditional Starbucks, and then look what they were willing to do when they were asked and if they wanted to come into a community.
Required to do.
Required to, right. So there is a lot of work that needs to be done, and we think we need more funding, we need regulation, but we also need incentives as we move forward, and we would welcome your suggestions as how we can ensure that we protect the character of our communities and promote the beautiful aspects of our country.
You're here.
I want to suggest that the report could be enriched by recognizing the scenic conservation opportunities in at least two urgent problems. The first is climate change. This is the great issue of our time, challenging both our present and our future. As communities strive to become more resilient, I believe significant funds will begin to flow into remedial measures and new technologies. This presents an opportunity for scenic conservation to score big gains as we restore wetlands and build new buffer parks, plant thousands of trees, and build innovative model communities. For example, will technologies like solar panels look clunky and therefore meet resistance? Or will new technologies benefit from great design and therefore be widely accepted? Let's bring in the Italian designers for the next generation of sustainable design. Second, affordable housing. Many of our rapidly gentrifying cities are unaffordable for people who have lived there for generations. This is creating tremendous class and racial conflict. As America begins to confront this challenge, Scenic America can help local governments and nonprofit developers see the potential, which you've shown in your slides, in restoring and reusing historic buildings for affordable housing, thereby conserving the embodied energy of the old buildings and designing publicly subsidized housing of the highest quality and environmental efficiency that can fit seamlessly into the neighborhood and preserve and strengthen community character. Some solutions and tools. I recognize the need to lay out a succinct national agenda in this report, especially at a time when Congress has allowed the Historic Preservation Fund to expire, as Martha's spoken of, and when many review processes that we have taken for granted, Section 4F and Section 106, to name but two, that are being undermined at every turn. But I would suggest that the proposed solutions in the report focus too heavily on federal and state programs and the policies of large, inaccessible corporations. The days of categorical grants for byways and gateways and streetscapes, I'm afraid, are over. There may be some disagreement with that, but it seems like block grants are going to be more of the thing of the future. I suggest a major shift in the report's focus to local action and local tools, building on Scenic America's greatest strength, creating beautiful communities and conserving landscapes through community action. And toward this end, let me suggest 5 actions or tools to emphasize. The first, the Scenic City Certification Program of Scenic Texas is among the most promising actions in the report, and I think it could be greatly amplified. Certification can reward and publicize best practices statewide and nationally without relying on government. A great example of this is the LEED certification. This is the Leadership in Energy Conservation and Design. Much sought after, expensive to obtain, and now the standard. The challenge is to infuse both principles and practices of scenic conservation into citywide comprehensive plans, zoning regulations, and the manifestos of other related organizations, and then hold everybody's feet to the fire. Franchise design can become one element of certification, but I do not believe it is the principal challenge to highlight in this report. Ron's book, Saving Face, is filled with examples of fine franchise design that can be incorporated into local certification programs. The second tool, computer visual simulation. Bill Brenton referred to this. I think visual simulation could make a profound difference in community design if planners and advocates would only use it routinely. Visual simulation allows you to look at change before it occurs and to weigh visual effects of proposed design alternatives. If we can test house paint colors in our local paint store using visual simulation, why can't cities use this invaluable tool to show how billboards will impact a streetscape or a landscape, where buildings will cast shadows, how different exterior finishes will fit in with their context? Third tool, viewshed analysis. It's another underemployed tool to determine the landscape impacts. For example, as large-scale wind turbines are sited, we would do well to anticipate their visual effects and work with companies to site them as sensitively as possible. Fourth, visual preference surveys. These can strengthen the case with local officials for preserving community character. So many people argue that community character is subjective and therefore they dismiss it. But more good data on what people value could be a powerful tool in community conservation. And fifth, publicize the research on the effects of the visual environment on health and behavior, and develop a research agenda enlisting the best minds in the field of environmental psychology, ophthalmology, landscape design, mental health, to study the impact of what we see on how we feel and what we think. Finally, I urge you in this report to call out your nation's capital, the District of Columbia, for its failure to practice the highest principles of scenic conservation. thanks to Scenic America for your recent online petition regarding the billboards that are going up in this city. And please continue to speak up and speak out for your capital city. Thank you.
Thank you.